Hello, hello. Thank you very much for the warm-up, guys. That was very ably warmed up. So yes, my name is Matthew Pauley. I am Assistant Professor of Distilling. I, yes, as mentioned, worked at Thames Distillers under the tutelage of Charles Maxwell. I used to run the Oxley still for 5 of the shortest and longest years of my life, but we managed to make it work, and it happened, and it still exists to this day, so that's a testament. Then via Bombay Sapphire, I was then invited back to my old alma mater of Heriot-Watt University. And it's one thing to be invited back to somewhere where you've worked, but it's quite another to be invited back somewhere where you're actually a student, and they knew you as a student. And believe it or not, the place even smelt the same. So as I walked around, and then on my second week, I went, oh, there's a thing on gin going. And then I saw this gentleman here was giving a presentation in my second week as an academic, so all good fun. So right, this is the update after the proof of concept that was last year, okay? So stick with me for the results. That's the real nuggets. Okay, that's where the interesting stuff lies. As mentioned, I'm from Heriot-Watt University. This is funded by the Gin Guild, but also the Scottish section of the Institute of Brewing and Distilling, who do give out funds to people not from Scotland, believe it or not. So if you're looking, no, seriously, they seem to think it's a Scottish only thing. The point of the job that money is to do is to further knowledge within distilling. Okay, so if you have an idea, you can apply for funding to the Scottish section of the Institute of Brewing and Distilling. You could be in Dubai or wherever, so long as it falls within the remit and they are happy. So thank you to the Scottish section of the Institute of Brewing and Distilling. Okay, I love this. This is great. It's got 2 buttons. Can't go wrong. Okay, before we continue, we need to really establish what is gin, because it's an excellent start point. And bedtime reading, if they're snappily titled EU Regulation 2019-787, talking about the flavour of gin, and this is possibly some of the most famous regulations around gin as it currently stands. So yes, the bit we're really interested in, flavouring of ethyl alcohol, that's fine, it can't be catalytically cracked. Alkenes, agricultural origin with juniper berries, right? Juniper communamis L, they're specific as to exactly what kind of juniper you can use. You can't just go foraging and find any old juniper. Flavouring substances, yes, that's lovely. Both should be used. It was written by lawyers, by the way, so hence the reason it's so snappily written. Production of gins, so the taste is predominantly that of juniper. So that's the most famous bit, the predominantly that of juniper. And there was a discussion we had at Back to Havens again some years ago now, where we talked around that. It was about originally it was about not stifling creativity within the industry. But at what point does that become a license to sort of make gin that isn't gin? That is a debate for another day. And then the lesser-known regulation, equally snappily titled EU Regulation 1334/2008, the use of flavouring must not mislead the consumer, and their presence in food should therefore always be indicated by appropriate labelling. And as you know, gin fans in the audience, this is not the first time that people have added things to gin that should not have been added to gin. So particular favourite being sulfuric acid. Sulfuric acid, if distilled in the presence of ethanol, produces ethyl sulfite, which is the ether. Remember, that it's one of the first anaesthetics. So that's why they would add sulfuric acid, as well as all sorts of other things, turpentine and various other things, giving gin at that time the nickname rot me gut and will kill me quick. So there we go. That's, like I say, it's not the first time people have added stuff to gin and maybe misled the consumers. Right, so data people like numbers, right? They like big numbers. They like lots and lots of samples. And I had a problem. I needed lots and lots of samples of gin for relatively cheap money. So what I found out was there were these whole groups of people who had loads of gins, loads and loads of samples of gins. And if you talk to them nicely, they will actually let you have some of those samples of gins. So shout outs to KD Media and the Scottish Gin Awards, who've been helpful on 2 separate occasions in supplying me with samples. And then also to the Scottish Gin Cooperative, who were able to send me hundreds and hundreds of gin samples in abundance. And they literally arrived one day from Aberdeen and said, here are some samples. I was like, excellent, let's go. So I was able to use these samples plus their associated sensory scores. So these were 2 things I really needed. I needed sensory scores and lots of gin samples. So at the end of it, having collected over 2 separate years, I had 175 juniper forward gin samples. Now that's a lot of gin samples, right? And unfortunately, or fortunately, they were in fairly small bottles, so I had to be quick so I didn't lose any volatile. So we had 175 juniper forward gin samples in total. I used the sensory scores, but important note, I mainly used the scores neat, so not mixed with tonic water. So that way you're just getting the presence or absence of the compounds within the juniper, or within the gin rather. Then the analysis, we used GCMS, gas chromatography. We also used solid phase microextraction, in case you were wondering. And this was used by a method that was originally cooked up between me, a PhD student called Jan Hodel, who's doing another gin-based PhD with the Borders Distillery in Scotland, as well as our analytical Dutchman, who's our resident analytical chemist, a man called Martin, who is a heavy metal fan, which makes sense because he looks at very small things. So he listens to heavy metal, gets all that frustration out of his system, and then goes and looks at very, very tiny, very sensitive pieces of equipment, where if you do one small thing, the whole thing's ruined for the day. So we use this method, and you can look it up if you're that way inclined. So then we had lots and lots of data. Remember last year we had lots of ones and zeros. It's presence or absence of a compound. So we had yes, 1, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0. And it went on for a huge amount of different chemicals. I think we had over 200 different chemicals on the 175 different gin samples. So with all those ones and zeros, I tried to find patterns. It comes to a point where 9 samples you can find a pattern. 175 samples, you start to boggle the human mind. So I then had to outsource that pattern finding to artificial intelligence. Now, there would have been a time when I'd have to explain what artificial intelligence was. It's a bit like PPE. There was a time when I had to be like, so artificial intelligence, and I had to do it this way, where they pick a pattern, it says yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, yes. And you basically, the yes is in the nose, and eventually it builds a pattern. Well, now you all know huge amounts about it. You're all experts, amateur experts in artificial intelligence. Used in looking for spam filters for emails is one of the other things. You very rarely get as much spam as you used to these days. I certainly don't anyway. Also, it looks for patterns. And patterns can be like literal pictures, can be patterns. Sounds can be turned into patterns because you can then turn that sound into like a visual representation. So you can look into patterns. You can do all sorts of things. There's an app on your phone that if you're standing in the woods, which sometimes, I've been known to be, I've just come back from the Isle of Skye with loads of trees and birds, and you can stand there with an app on your phone and go, what is that bird? And it goes, oh, from looking at the pattern of the noise that it makes, of the bird song, it says, oh, that's a, insert bird name here. So yeah, anything can be a pattern. Lots of cuckoos, by the way, on the west coast of Scotland, bizarre. So I was a man in search of an algorithm. So I started off with the Heriot-Watt spin-out, which was trying to make artificial intelligence for the people, making it so that you can, any person without learning to code could use artificial intelligence. So they promptly went out of business and gave me 3 hours notice that this was happening. So I was like, oh, okay. So I had to quickly go and find another algorithm, which I dutifully did, and found out that actually I did the 2-week free trial as a proof of concept and found out it was going to cost me $60,000 to actually use the full commercially viable thing. That wasn't going to happen. I was like, excuse me, Gin Guild, have you got $60,000? So I was a man under a certain circumstance where really the only option was to go to a PC World with my credit card and spend £600 on a laptop. So buy me a laptop, download the software, and then that way I am acting as the host and I've got it and no one can do anything with it. No one can stop me from using it. So we used H2O Flow, which is a free piece of software that you can use. It's nothing new. This is nothing new, all of this, by the way. So with an algorithm, you've got to train the algorithm. All those people using ChatGPT, yes, you know the ones. ChatGPT, you're helping them train the algorithm. And you're doing it for free. Some of you might even be paying them because you're giving them the data and then feeding back saying yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. I've been doing that, but I took 70% of my samples, 123 of the samples that were available, and trained my algorithm and told it yes, no for myself, spending the time. You've been doing that for free. Or paying them, I mean, honestly. Anyway, so 70% of those samples were the training samples, and then I kept some by. I kept 52 of those samples by with the scores, didn't show the algorithm the score. I was like, right, based on the pattern, the yes, no's, the ones and zeros, based on that pattern, what would be the sensory scores? Go, algorithm, go. So there's going to be a certain amount of audience participation. I hope that's okay. I know it's early. There's been no gin. Is that going to be okay? It's tough being the first guy up, I tell you. Especially if it's data-driven. Right, okay. So, using the root mean squared error, yes, exactly, of the compounds whose increased level is a positive indicator. Can I have a huzzah for the positive indicators? That wasn't a huzzah. I wanted a huzzah. Huzzah! Thank you, good Lord. Let's go woo. I didn't say, can I have a woo? Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. So anyway, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 compounds. And they are a positive indicator, worthy of a huzzah from anyone, I reckon. And the presence of these compounds indicates a high-scoring juniper-forward gin. Okay? I'm not going to tell you the compounds. I know you're wondering, what are those compounds? I'll tell you the compounds when I publish the paper, all right? Once I put it in the bag, I'll not show you the secrets just yet. So yes, these are the positive indicators. If they're in the presence or absence score, if they are present, then you have an increased chance. So it's not like direct. It is an increased chance of a positive score for a juniper-forward gin. Okay, onwards. I'm going to push the next button. Right, okay, now these ones, these are an indicator of a low scoring. So can I have a small, a raucous boo, please? Ready? And thank you, that's better. Right, okay. One more time, sorry. That was a bit more commitments to the boo, okay? I feel like you're not committing. 1, 2, 3. Boo. Oh, that's better. That's much better. A wholesome, hearty boo at this time in the morning. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Yeah, 15. Anyway, 15 compounds. Their indicator is of a low-scoring juniper-forward gin. Okay, and I can't talk about the specifics of the numbers of the accuracy, but we've increased it by about 10% with the increased number of samples and the different algorithm. So it's getting more and more powerful and more able to predict the juniper-forward nature of, or high-scoring juniper-forward gin. Conclusion, this is the corroborative previous proof of concept. So last year when I came and gave you a similar presentation, that was to see, can we actually do it, is it possible? And now we're making it increasing the accuracy of the algorithm so that we can then predict a high-scoring juniper-forward gin. What we need, more gin samples. And I'm going to write another funding request to the Scottish Institute of Brewing and Distilling so that we can do some more analytical chemistry. So each one of those samples requires analysis, and each analysis costs an amount of money. And before you know it, the numbers get big pretty quick. So yes, we're going to be testing both inputs and outputs, and eventually I'd like to see if I can make a gin, an artificial gin, and then see what the sensory score is for that. It's tricky because those chemicals sometimes are made in chemical factories that aren't necessarily food grade. So I can't expose people to non-food grade chemicals. It's a whole ethical minefield. But anyway, thank you very much. I feel like I'm very, very quick. But here are some references if you're one of those referencey type people to prove that it is actual real. I'm not just making it up. Thank you very much. And that's my contact. Oh, I've got a little scanny. Wonderful. You can scan me on LinkedIn. Does anyone have any questions? Is that neat gin? No, it is not. It is water, thankfully. Yes, and rock, hello.
I'm sorry, can I just
do your best bellow, Anne, come on.
You mentioned that these gins are juniper forwards.
Yes.
How are they defined as being juniper forward?
Well, this is it. There is a certain amount that we have to trust that the people submitting the samples...
So it was defined by the distiller?
It's defined by the people running the awards. I'd imagine that they would have to be making the call on that.
Okay.
Certainly, I know that I think the Gin Cooperative were quite strict on what was what. But yeah, it's there has to be an element of trust.
Is it an analytical or a?
Well, the analytical is the bit we're trying to do.
That's the bit you're doing.
Yes.
So, do you know how the awards define a juniper forward gin?
Well, I'm hoping that they stick to the EU regulation because otherwise it's illegal.
But then surely
that's the only definition we have to work with. Sorry?
Sorry, I'm going
to... we're going to align with the legal definition because otherwise... Well, I need juniper forward gin samples, and you can be a distilled gin and be juniper forward. So I just need... I don't see what the problem is there. Anyway. I'm hoping they stick to the legal definition because otherwise everything is meaningless.
Hi, so I'm trying to link one of your first slides, which was all the definitions and predominantly flavoured by juniper, and one of your last slides, which said that you're looking to possibly have a sort of a test of some kind.
Yes.
Is that your ultimate aim? Is it
right? So there's
to you, and you then say, sorry, that doesn't qualify. It's not juniper forward.
There are many different applications we could have of this. like you have with every algorithm and every sort of data training set. It could be working similar to the, I'm not a football fan, when you have the camera on the lines to say that ball has crossed the line or it hasn't crossed the line. It could be used for education and training of distillers to say, this is what it looks like, make your gin so it formulates that. It could be used to formulate gins sort of reverse engineering wise that you could predict, say, well, this will be a highly performing gin. So yeah, all these things, they could be gouged in many different directions and used for good and education, and it could be used as a part of a legislative framework. That would be, I would love that to be the case, that we could be some way to that being happening. We're kicking the can further down the alley. We're not like all the way down the alley just yet. Any further questions? Aha. Hello.
Hi. So have you managed to tie these compounds to root botanicals that they've come from?
So the thing about botanicals, I did a Ginposium, when was it? Many years ago now, where we did the Venn diagram of gin botanicals. And what we found, the reason I came up with the Venn diagram is you cannot say, yes, alpha and beta pinene, yes, they live in juniper, but they also live in angelica root, and they also live in various other. There is linalool, and the gin fans amongst us will know coriander is the linalool, is like the signature chemical within, linalool is the signature chemical within coriander, but you can also find linalool in juniper berries. You can also find linalool in citrus fruits. You can also, there's various, so yes, botanicals, it comes from botanicals, but to say that this is the one botanical, we know what gives a juniper characteristic, and I've distilled a lot of juniper berry samples, I can tell you that. At one point I did 9 distillations a day, so sort of like 3 ago, and in that little lab in Heriot-Watt in the G18, I was on casters. But yes, and so you can pin it down to being what is the characteristics contributed by juniper to gin by distilling them in isolation. So yeah, that's the start point to that. I think that was probably answering your question. Any other further? Any other further questions? No? Did I canter through that a bit too quickly? That's all right, because there'll be other people who pull up the slack. So anyway, thank you very much, ladies and gents. I'm going to put that down there. Thank you.